Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers for March 1st, 2011, the 21st legislative day of the 2011 session of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Scott Slade. Coming up in tonight's program, the bill to revise the Hope Scholarship and pre-K funding passes the House. Critics say more time is needed to perfect the bill. A zero-based budgeting bill clears the Senate. The measure would require line-by-line review of the budget, and supporters say the bill makes government more transparent. We continue our leadership interview series tonight. Senate Higher Education Chairman Senator Jim Butterworth will join us. And Senate leaders say final passage of the FY 2011 amended budget is close. For analysis, I'll be joined by Alan Essig, Executive Director of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. We'll talk about whether or not Georgia's budgeting process has finally hit bottom. All that is coming up tonight on Primetime Lawmakers. But first, a sweeping revision of the Hope Scholarship clears the House. Mwandi Lawson is standing by at the Capitol with that story. Good evening, Mwandi.
Good evening, Scott. There was just over 90 minutes of discussion on the House floor this afternoon, and House Bill 326 cleared that body by a vote of 152 to 22. Bill sponsor Representative Doug Collins emphasized that the legislation marks the end of a Hope Scholarship that's tied to the cost of tuition.
By the time the appropriations process is done in the General Assembly each year, the factor rate will be set through appropriations, and you will know what factor you are getting. For this first year, it will be 90% of tuition.
The bill was modified to allow students earning a 3.3 GPA to qualify for the Zell Miller full tuition scholarship, down from the 3.7 grade point average in the original bill.
If they fall below a 3.3, they will still be able to maintain the Hope Scholarship on the standard factor rate level, which would be in this next year 90% or whatever that factor rate up or down may be in the future.
A needs-based 1% interest loan program established in 2008 would now include incentives to teach K through 12 science, technology, engineering, and math.
What we have added here, however, is a way that you can have a year-for-year payback, or in other words, for loan forgiveness, if they go into what is a STEM area of teaching, K through 12, science, technology area as we go forward. So that is something where if someone has a needs-based loan, they obtain that up to a $10,000 loan. If they go into teaching, they can have that 1 year per every year they teach taken off or forgiven in this system.
But some argue that the plan does not offer higher education opportunities to enough students.
Even with the changes our leadership has been able to make in this very bad bill, I want to applaud them for those changes, but they're not enough. When you look at the 1% loan, and if only $10 million is allocated this year, we're talking about maybe 800 students being helped, maybe 1,000 students. That's not enough.
Representative Collins says the legislation will inspire the Lottery Corporation to increase contributions to the Hope Fund.
And the way we're going to do that is tie bonuses to the amount deposited into the Lottery for Education account. What will happen is the bonuses will be capped at 25% for such employees' base compensation. However, here's the caveat that was added. The bonuses will be paid out of 1% of the total amount that was the net increase into Lottery for Education. So if you look at that, the more that the Lottery Corporation wants to have for bonuses, the more they will need to put into the Lottery for Education account. That gives them the 1% that they can pay their bonuses on. It also gives an incentive to put more money into our Lottery for Education account, which in turn helps everybody involved. The more money goes in, the higher the factor rate can be, the more we can help students as they go along in their current education process.
Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers says the Senate will waste no time taking up the matter, but some work still needs to be done.
One thing I don't want us to get boxed in on is a percentage, because at the end of the day we're looking for dollars, not a percentage, because a large percentage of a small pool it may not be better than a small percentage of a large pool. So at the end of the day, we need as many dollars put back into education as possible. So when you're looking at awarding bonuses to people who work for the Lottery Corporation, I think perhaps the best way to go about that is to tie that bonus to the amount of dollars that they put back into education.
One area not addressed in the legislation passed today, the pre-K program. The governor's plan to increase the number of slots by 5,000 for the pre-K program, as well as to reduce the day that's offered from 6 hours to 4.5. That will be addressed in the FY 2012 budget. Again, HB 326 passed the House this afternoon by a vote of 152 to 22. It now moves to the Senate. In the Senate today, a vote for the fourth time to move from continuation budgeting to zero-based budgeting. Senator Senator David Schaefer presented Senate Bill 33.
So that the executive branch of government will be required to justify all of the proposed spending and not just the new spending. I think it gives the legislature important tools to identify waste and to be better stewards of the taxpayers' dollars.
Schaefer says Governor Nathan Deal's office asked the General Assembly to delay application until the 2013 budget cycle. Senator George Hooks says zero-based budgeting worked when Jimmy Carter implemented it as governor, and this would go a long way towards making the budget process more transparent.
There are some branches of state government who will let people go and have vacancies in their base budget. They will leave those vacancies unfilled, but they will continue to roll that salary forward in what's known as continuation budget. So therefore, they will keep the money, but roll the positions forward. This will allow us to go back to a zero base, build the budget from there, and know exactly where the taxpayers' money is.
SB 33 passed 51-0. It now goes to the House. The work of the Special Counsel on Tax Reform and Fairness surfaced yesterday as legislation to overhaul, including a tax on services, a return to a grocery tax, and a reduction to 4% for both personal and corporate taxes. Kelly McCutcheon of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation says that the gradual tax rate phase-in called for in HB 385 may not be necessary.
What that shows is we do not need to decrease the tax rates over time. The report shows we can immediately go to 4% on the personal income tax and the corporate income tax and still have $348 million left over. No one wants to hurt low-income families, and what we're looking at, when you don't tax groceries, everyone gets the benefit, including wealthy individuals. And what you can do is take that extra money, which makes our sales tax revenues much more stable and makes them grow much more over time if you tax groceries like we do at the local level already, and then you take a portion of those proceeds and provide tax credits to offset the impact on low-income families. You also have to remember that for those below the poverty level, they're eligible for food stamps, and if they're buying food with food stamps, that's not taxable either.
The legislative tax package will be considered by the House Ways and Means Committee. In other news, the House today agreed to require that children up to age 8 ride in booster seats if they're less than 4 feet 9 inches tall. Representative Alan Powell says House Bill 279 has been promoted by Children's Healthcare of Atlanta.
Currently under Georgia law, if a child is 6 years of age, weighs less than 40 pounds or less than 4 foot 9 inches high, they're expected to be in a child restraint seat. That's what this does. This raises that age from 6 to 8. Now, the reason for that is that there's a lot of children that are not of that weight standard nor of that height standard. And if they're put into a 3-point safety device without a restraint, then these belts, in the case of an accident, has created a lot of injuries to these children.
But the bill did not draw universal support. Representative Ed Setzler says it could unfairly punish parents.
Let's say there's a parent that piles their 3 kids into the back of the minivan. There's 7 seat belts in the minivan, and they have the 3 kids jump in the back. They all buckle themselves in, and the youngest one's 7 years old. As they're driving down the road, if they're inadvertently and tragically hit by a drunk driver or hit by some other motorist, and that child dies, it's not the drunk driver's responsibility for that child dying. The parent who didn't follow this law, who had a 7-year-old that fit perfectly into their car, fit perfectly into this shoulder strap, is now criminally responsible for the death of that child.
HB 279 passed by a vote of 129 to 43. It'll next be considered in the Senate. In the Senate today, agreement on a bill that requires educational standing to back up the claim that someone is a nurse. Here's Senator Buddy Carter.
If you remember back a couple of years ago, we passed a law that required, in order to use the title registered nurse or LPN, you indeed had to be one of those. But when we did that, we simply forgot to add the title nurse, plainly nurse. And of course, if you're in distress and someone comes up to you and says that they're a nurse, then you expect for them to be a nurse.
SB 67 passed 50-3 and moves to the House. Senate leadership today affirmed their support for immigration legislation making its way through the House. Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers told reporters this afternoon that HB 87 is a good piece of legislation, which he would like to see backed up by Senator Judson Hill's Senate Bill 27. That measure holds contractors, subcontractors, and local governments responsible for ensuring that their workers are in the country legally, with penalties for those who do not comply.
For instance, if the affidavit is not submitted or is improper or whatever, they haven't complied, and through a random audit that's found out, they have the right to cure. The city of, I'll pick on the city of Marietta, for example, whatever, city of Dublin, whatever. They have the right to cure. If they don't cure, then they will have then they're not able to participate in some other contracting. If they do this a second time, then they're subject to having 10% of their state funds withheld in the next fiscal year.
SB 27 is currently awaiting approval by the Senate Judiciary Committee. Reporting live from the Capitol, I'm in Wandy Lawson for Primetime Lawmakers.
Hey, Wandy, turning back to the HOPE legislation that passed today, how does it impact students who are not going to a traditional four-year college, like those who go to technical school? Do they still qualify for HOPE scholarships or grants?
Yeah, actually, Scott, they do. Technical college students can still qualify for HOPE grants under this new legislation. They do have a GPA requirement of 3.0 that's being added to that, but unlike students at other institutions, they are eligible for remedial classes. Those are being cut out at the four-year institutions. The bill also retains the HOPE GED voucher, and that's a $500 higher education scholarship for students who earn a GED.
Well, thanks, Wandy. A lot of news made on that today. Thanks for the report.
Thanks.
While the House was debating the governor's plan on the HOPE scholarship this afternoon, and Wandy was talking to the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee about claims that the bill is moving too quickly through the General Assembly. Senator Jim Butterworth is the subject of tonight's leadership segment.
As far as the input, I'm of the opinion that it's been inclusive. In addition to those types of meetings, we've also had private conversations with a number of different people, other constituents, Senate colleagues that had ideas, and all of those things have kind of melded into what the bill is right now.
Senate Democrats have said that they've been kind of cut out from the process. They've also said that they had called for some hearings to be held on this matter and that they weren't held during the last summer. And I'm wondering, is there going to be any opportunity for public input as the bill is making its way through the Senate?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, I'm meeting shortly with some students from Kennesaw State, I believe, and open to input from them, from actual HOPE scholarship recipients, open to input from the technical schools. I've had extended conversations. I talked to the president of North Georgia Technical College yesterday, and other representatives from the technical schools, and that will be ongoing. There are concerns, there are issues that definitely would need some consideration and perhaps some tweaking. That's what we're doing, and it will be a fluid environment as we bring the final bill. There were a number of different conversations that took place, I know, with the minority leader and with some other representatives that he designated. So there were some conversations. Whether other members of the minority party knew about those conversations, I have absolutely no idea. But I think the main part, though, is that the bill did start in the House. That was inclusive, and there are Democratic signers on the bill. And as we're coming over to the Senate with the bill, those conversations are ongoing, and we'll definitely address any specific proposals that they have, regardless of what the history has been up to this point. Like I've already mentioned, we're open to input. We're open to, and we're eager for input that will make this work. Because the bottom line is, if we do nothing, if we complain, if we don't give specific proposals, the HOPE scholarship, the HOPE grant, and the funding for pre-K will go away.
Senator Steve Thompson was in the well this morning talking about how he favors a program that would both use a means test as well as a merit test for students coming in. What are your thoughts about perhaps placing some sort of an income cap on HOPE scholarship recipients?
Well, there may be some ideas that are proposed. The numbers that I've seen up to this point, you could debate why you would do that. And I would give you a number, 6% of all of the HOPE recipients right now, scholarship and grant. That would affect 6%. If we set a ceiling at $150,000, example, if anybody above that, if there is a family that earns more than that on an annual basis, above that, they're not eligible for HOPE. That would affect 6% of the current recipients of the HOPE scholarship. Is that something that we want to do? Because, as I've stated on a number of previous occasions, what we're trying to do is we're trying to not only attract the best and brightest to Georgia, to have them here, but we're trying to keep them here. Let's think of the ultimate goal of the HOPE Scholarship and the ultimate vision of the HOPE Scholarship, and that is to keep the economic engine running with these bright minds, regardless of the current income level. And let's also not forget that we're calling the economy that we're in right now the Great Recession. And just because somebody might make $150,000, $175,000 this year, you never know what might happen next year or last year. So that's a tough issue to approach, but like I've already stated, we're open to input and we're open to listening for sure.
What about the role of the actual lottery revenues? You know, we're hearing that obviously Georgia has a very highly ranked lottery, but is not necessarily the highest when it comes to those proceeds going to education. Do you see any room for modifying how that works?
Absolutely. I think there are ongoing conversations. I do think that the lottery is in a partnership with the convenience stores. We've had extended conversation with the Convenience Store Association, and as you know, we lowered the initial percentage from a 7% payment to the lottery or to the convenience stores to 5%. We've actually now rolled that back up to 6%. That's close to a $39 million savings. I mean, that's a large part of the operating benefit. And again, like we've already commented, everybody is concerned about their skin in the game. But this makes the convenience stores have some skin in the game. As far as the lottery itself, we've addressed some of the bonuses that the lottery individuals get. And those bonuses are not just top-tiered individuals. It's anybody from, and I've seen the list, it's anybody from the president of the lottery corporation to a warehouse manager. They get, as part of their annual payment, is their annual salary, the annual package, they get a bonus as well. So we've addressed some of that, and if that's a way to help them raise the bar, and then we want to do that. There are also other concerns about what the legislation actually says. It says 35%. That's what the Lottery Corporation will deposit into the Hope Scholarship, Hope Grant. We're not there. The Lottery Corporation says we're 26%. Other numbers show 24%. And I think we do need to address getting more towards that 35% level. And if that comes through legislation, that's great. If the Lottery Corporation can work on that issue themselves, I'm all for that, because as far as the lottery professionals, they're the ones in the business. We don't want to come tell them how to run their business unless we absolutely have to. But if we absolutely have to, we'll do that too.
Senator Jim Butterworth is the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee. We want to thank you for your insights today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
After the short break, work continues on the state's budgets. I'll be joined on set by Alan Essig, Executive Director of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, for an update on the process. Have we hit bottom, and what's that going to look like to the typical Georgian? Stay with us. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. Late last week, the Georgia Senate passed HB 77, the 2011 amended budget. That's the bill that adjusts the budget for the current year to reflect actual revenue collections. At a press conference today, Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers said the House and the Senate were very close to agreeing on the $18.5 billion spending bill, and remarkably, it might pass without going to conference committee. With work on the supplemental budget mostly out of the way, legislators can now begin to focus on the FY 2012 general budget, known as the big budget. In a primetime politics taping about fiscal solutions in the federal deficit today, I spoke with journalists who cover the legislature and budget issues, and here's what Tom Crawford and Jim Galloway had to say about pending legislation, possible tax reform, and structural deficits. Structural deficit, one of the things that came up, especially from Robert Bixby. I mean, it's almost in our DNA now.
Well, and we have it on the state level too, Scott. Alan Essig of the Georgia Budget Policy Institute has made the point many times that because of all the tax exemptions and tax breaks that have been enacted over the years for businesses and special interests, that we have that same kind of structural deficit here in Georgia, to the point where even when the economy recovers and we're back hopefully at full steam again, we just won't be able to fund all the services that the state funded 5 and 10 years ago because we just won't be able to raise the revenues because of the tax structure.
Aren't we leaving a lot of money on the table? I mean, this comes up over and over again. The exemptions maybe exempt, what, half the money that might be collected in sales tax?
It's a lot. I think one estimate I heard was $1.1 billion during the Tax Reform Council debates. So yeah, there's a lot of money involved here that for one reason or another has been exempted over the years.
You've got a zero-based budget bill that has it passed the Senate?
Senate passed it today,
It
yes.
just flew through the Senate very quickly. Remember, they overrode Sonny Perdue's veto of a previous zero-based budgeting bill, and they've sent it to the House. The problem you get into there is that you get on turf. You have some turf battles brewing because with zero-based budgeting, that there are members of the House who think that impinges on the House's authority over the budget, and so that runs into something. You have another problem with Tabor, which the Senate passed last week, which limits ties budget growth, state budget growth to the inflation rate. Well, it's the governor's role to set how much money is spent each year in the state budget, and that would tread on his turf.
Jim Galloway, Tom Crawford, and I hope you'll watch for that Primetime Politics episode where we talk about the fiscal solutions to the federal deficit. Joining me now is Alan Essig, Executive Director of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. He's an expert on state budget policy. Thanks for being here. And you were at that presentation today at the Atlanta Kiwanis Club with the Fiscal Solutions Tour, Alice Rivlin and David Walker and other. What did you take away from that in Georgia's role in this whole deficit problem?
Well, it was a fascinating conversation from some of the leading federal budget experts in the country, laying out the scope of the problem and laying out some of the potential solutions. And they emphasized the important role that Senator Saxby Chambliss is playing in Washington in trying to come together in a bipartisan way to try to find some solutions to the long-term fiscal problem facing the country.
We've been hearing this term structural deficit that's built into the framework now. The sheetrock's on top of the structural deficit. I mean, how big a deal is that in Georgia, and how does Georgia attack that in our policy?
Well, we do have a structural deficit in the state. The last 3 years, the deficit's been caused overwhelmingly by the Great Recession, by an unprecedented drop in revenues. But even when the economy does come back, revenue growth is projected not to. It's going to be very tough for normal revenue growth to meet what the normal expenditures are of the state. We have tens of thousands of new students in our higher education system in K through 12, people eligible for Medicaid until we change sentencing laws. We have more and more inmates in the prison system. Go on the services that Georgians are demanding, the services that the law requires us to give. It's going to be hard under the current tax structure for revenues to increase enough to meet those needs.
Let's take a look at that 3-year trend. I think we've got that graphic that we can bring up, and certainly this is something that you've been talking about for quite a while. The change in funds from FY 2009 to 2012. And Alan, if I got these figures right, what you said, between 2009 and 2012, we are dealing with 14.6% less.
Yeah, it's about $3 billion less in expenditures today than the 2009 budget, and it's not across the board 15%. 15%. There are some agencies that have been cut 25, 30, even more. Some agencies that the governor and General Assembly have tried to prioritize education, but they've still been cut by 14, 15%.
Now we have to balance our budget in Georgia.
Yes, so we don't have a choice. The choice there is two choices. I mean, we can depend totally on budget cuts, or we can do a more balanced approach and have some revenue increases in addition to that that could ameliorate some of the worst of the cuts. We've overwhelmingly chosen the budget cut route, although Governor Perdue has included last year some revenue increases. Governor Deal has not included revenue increases at this point.
And even though the budget's reduced by 15%, Georgia's grown in these 3 years, and we've got a lot more kids to educate. There's more indigent care to pay for.
Yeah, there's healthcare inflation. I mean, the needs of the state and the growth of the state hasn't stopped. The good news is that revenues are starting to increase. We've had about 8 straight months of revenue increases. We're up about 8% for the year. That's positive, and hopefully that'll continue. The problem is that 6, 7, 8% growth, isn't going to be enough to cover the normal growth of government, no less putting back some of those cuts that we've dealt with for the last 2 or 3 years.
Now, you've studied the tax reform package that came from the council, the special counsel, and the General Assembly is now taking a look at that in that joint committee. Would that be enacting that package be the quickest way to turn things around in Georgia? I mean, is that I hate to use the word panacea, but is that a major fix?
Nothing's a panacea, but there's a lot of positive aspects to what the tax council recommendations were. We think over the long term, it would improve the revenue growth in the state. It would set the tax code up to be more relevant to the 21st century economy that we're in, and it would allow revenues to grow as the economy grows. In the long term, that would have a positive impact on the budget.
And more of it's consumption based too, right? I mean, I should say, you do wind up leaning on a little more sales tax for services and things like that.
Right. Yes.
And that's more stable?
It's more stable, but we don't want to go too much to the extent of, one of the strengths of the Georgia tax system is it's balanced. It's balanced between income and sales, and if you include the local property taxes. And that's something that most economists think is key parts of a really solid tax structure.
Over that 3 years, when we've had to pull back 15%, and the state kept growing, fewer dollars for more people, how has that impacted state services? The typical Georgian, how's the typical Georgian feeling that?
Well, it's been across the board. If you have a child in school, there may be larger class sizes, there may be fewer school days, there may be shorter school days. If you're in the higher education, if you're a child in the university system, you're paying more tuition. If you're in South Georgia and you depend on services of the Department of Agriculture, they have been cut by 30, 35%. It's health and safety, it's regulatory, it's our parks. It's our motor vehicles, how long we have to wait online to get driver's licenses. I mean, it's from the core health, safety, and education to some of the more mundane things the state does. But it's across the board. Every agency has been impacted significantly by it.
So the 2012 budget, the big budget, is looking realistic now compared to the revenue that you've been seeing, the bill and revenue. We can more or less depend on some of those numbers now, do you think?
Well, I think the governor's revenue estimate is conservative enough that I'm not worried about making the budget next year. I don't think we're going to have to go through, unless things happen out of our control, whether internationally or with oil or something like that. The revenues estimate should be solid enough to get us through. The question, and I think one of the strengths of the governor's revenue estimate in the amended budget was he didn't increase it even though revenues are increased. One of the things that we have to do is rebuild our rainy day fund, our reserves. And I think the governor in the amended budget, rightly so, has planned for several $100 million of surplus that will be rolled over into the reserves. Our reserves are down to about $100 million. We need to get it up to between 1.5 and 2 billion sometime in the next 3 or 4 years. The bonding agencies are expecting that. So we're prepared for the next recession. The question is whether the revenue estimate in 2012 is conservative enough to drive a surplus we'll need next year to continue to rebuild the rainy day fund.
Well, in on that, I found some optimism. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure.
Alan Essig, great to have you with us. Coming up tomorrow on Primetime Lawmakers, Democratic leaders are expected to announce their alternative to Governor Deal's program to fix hope in pre-K. We'll have the details. We'll bring you another installment in our leadership interview series. Secretary of State Brian Kemp is scheduled to appear, plus in-depth analysis on important legislative issues and the latest Capitol news. That's tomorrow night at 7. If you'd like to see a repeat of this broadcast, Primetime Lawmakers can be seen at 5:30 tomorrow morning on GPB. Coming up next, Bert Wolf, Travels and Traditions. Tonight's episode features great hotels of the world, so stay tuned for that. And that's our broadcast for this 21st legislative day of the 2011 session. Thanks to our guests for joining us tonight. For Nwandi Lawson and the whole Primetime Lawmakers team, I'm Scott Slade. Have a good night.
This is a GPB original production.